welcome to That Was the Week. It is Friday, October the 16th, and this is Keith Tier. Welcome to the show. This week's newsletter is all about what happened in the last few days. Platforms or publishers, who decides what is true or what is false? The brouhaha started when the New York Post published some hacked files from Hunter Biden's hard drive, which showed his, let's say, less than worthy character in their view. And immediately it was published, Facebook and then Twitter interfered with its distribution. The interference took different forms in both platforms. And what was surprising was almost immediately Jack Dorsey of Twitter intervened with his team to say that that was an inappropriate intervention, and asked his team to look at the policy, and the policy was immediately reversed. Facebook, on the other hand, hasn't made any changes. Now, these decisions by Facebook and Twitter produced a lot of reaction. Let's start with John Battelle. This is, with John Battelle. John Battelle is very well known, I'm sure, to those of you who lived through the Web 2.0 era. When Facebook prevented the post from being distributed, he said, "Excuse me while I point out the most fucking obvious thing in the world. When it comes to what an editor actually does, we draw lines about what is and is not acceptable, either as fact, as truth, as hypocrisy, or what is in the public interest. That's the damn job of journalists, to call bullshit. And regardless of Facebook's long-standing claims to not be a publisher or a journalistic entity, the truth is these actions prove the company understands it is an arbiter of facts, truth, and the public interest. The simple reality is this: the company has tried to have it both ways for too fucking long. It's time we treat Facebook for what it is, a media company, subject to the norms, responsibilities, and behaviors we all expect and demand from our media providers." So there Battelle is making the case that Facebook is not a platform, it's a media company, and it did the right thing here, acting to prevent things that it disagreed with from being published. Kara Swisher on CNBC had a different take.
That's kind of ridiculous to treat them like they're utilities or that they're part of the government, because they're not. There's lots of opportunity for the people to know. They don't have to know it from Facebook or Twitter anymore. They have to know it from the New York Times. You don't have to buy the New York Times, or you can buy it or whatever. And so I think that's just sort of, this idea of calling for the FCC to look into this and election interference. I mean, it's rich, given the history of election interference is mostly been from the Russians and other malevolent forces. So, and also with the FCC, they don't have a quorum, largely because this administration has not put in the commissioners necessary, approved the commissioners necessary. And so, unfortunately, when Josh Hawley was calling for bringing this to the FCC, he knows full well they can't meet because they don't have a quorum. And so the whole thing is just a lot of noise right ahead of the election. You're going to see a lot of these stories sort of pop up and suddenly bubble up. And I think it's going to be a real problem for these companies. And they're either going to have to very much explain what they're doing or not do it at all, which I think is what they've been doing for years now. So now that they've waded into this, they're going to have to wade all the way up to their neck.
So Kara, basically, different take, but she agrees with Battelle that these companies have every right to interfere because they're private companies, and more to the point, they should. And the FCC has no business to get involved. Something, by the way, that the founder of TechDirt agrees with. This is Mike Masnick, a very well-respected writer who's been on the tech scene for a long time, responding to the FCC's contention that it has legal authority over Article 230 of the Communications Act to interpret the meaning of that law. This is bullshit. And what's worse is that Pine knows it's bullshit and he's still doing it, says Masnick. So a lot of complex issues that basically are all supporting Facebook's right to be an editor, or also Twitter's right to be an editor. Now, my take this week in the editorial is completely different to that. I do not think that Facebook or Twitter should want to be publishers. They should want to be platforms. These are places where all of us, anyone that wants to, can get an account and can publish, and we can interact with each other. We can publish facts. We could even publish lies if we want. We can publish opinions, pretty much whatever we want. And for Facebook or Twitter to get in the way of that seems to be a huge mistake, something that Jack Dorsey recognized almost immediately. And within 24 hours, Twitter has declared that it will not interfere. It will allow users to make their own minds up, although it may label some of the data, something that I also disapprove of. So this week's That Was the Week is all about this. This is my point. The real decision here is whether the world can cope with platforms where a person or organization can express any legal perspective. The human race is diverse, as are its beliefs and opinions. Facts, of course, are facts, but thoughts and ideas are not. Can we collectively handle the existence of open platforms that can encompass the wide breadth of real-world points of view? Human beings are certainly capable of understanding that a platform, by definition, is open to all views. We can distinguish between ideas we agree with, ideas we disagree with, opinions, facts, beliefs. We can collectively discuss and debate these points of view, and we can change or become entrenched either way. And together we can influence each other by contributing facts, ideas, opinions, and beliefs. So please, Twitter and Facebook, don't interfere. Be a platform and let us get on with our lives free of anybody's attempts to stop us.
Wow. Well, that was good, Keith. Be a platform. That's what you say to Twitter and Facebook.
You mean, which is what, as Kara said, that's what they've always done, but now they're changing.
Well, they're not, because let's go back to the quote from, because I think you're mixing the arguments up here. I don't think necessarily there's a lot of disagreement. Let's go back to the John Battelle quote. Can we?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so we agree. I mean, you would agree that an editor is an editor, that he draw lines about what and what isn't acceptable, either as fact, as truth, as hypocrisy. That's what an editor does. So that's what we might do at Now TV. That's what the New York Times does. That's what the Washington Post does. That's what Battelle Media does.
Yeah.
So that no one's debating that what traditional media is, right?
Well, although I do think, there's a great department at Glasgow University, and they produce a series of books called Bad News, and they make the point that there's no such thing as an unbiased editor.
Yeah, well, we all know that. We're not going to, that's like Media 101. That's obvious. Yeah. And we all know that every editor are themselves biased. They come with a package of values and interests. That's given. We're not going to go back over that. So let's just look back at the Battelle quote, because I think there is a key issue here that we need to address,
okay,
which I'm not sure if you get or you're missing. So, and this is where I think I at least agree with Battelle, but I'm not sure if you either agree or understand what he's saying. He said, and this is the key bit of the quote, and regardless of Facebook's long-standing claims to not be a publisher or a journalistic entity, the truth is that these actions, the simple reality is this: the company has tried to have it both ways. It's time we treat Facebook for what it is, a media company. And I think his point, for better or worse, and I don't necessarily think we all love the idea of these platforms if they could exist in the real world, but the reality is they don't. And the reality is that Facebook is a media company. Leftists like Kara argue that it's always been Facebook's been a vehicle for the Russians. The rightists argue that it's a vehicle for people like Kara and John Battelle. But everybody agrees that that Facebook and Twitter are not just platforms. They have too much traffic. These are too big a business, and they're too vulnerable to propagandists of left and right and other governments to be just a platform. But the key issue here is, and I would be surprised if you disagree with this. That's the reality, for better or worse. However, these are not just platforms.
So, Andrew, you're going to be surprised then, because you said a few things there. You said there's too much traffic.
Well, no, I didn't. I said that they have too much traffic just to be disinterested. These are massive, multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar businesses, and everyone has some interest one way or the other. You know, governments have an interest.
You have to let me speak.
Okay, go on.
I know, but it's wonderful to see your passion on this. I know you really are very passionate about this. I do think that the nature of a platform is that it is ubiquitous. Like the telephone network globally is a platform, and it has massive traffic.
Right.
The text network, SMS and MMS, same. And so size and whether you're a platform or a publisher are not related. You can have big publishing platforms that are publishers, and you can also have big platforms that are not publishers. So I don't think size will help us to distinguish here. I also think that if these things are publications, they are the least focused publications you've ever seen, because every point of view on earth lives on them. And so the editor's doing a really, really bad job if they're publications. So to me,
well, I don't think that's what Battel's saying. He's not. The problem, I think, what Battel's arguing, which is the standard position, is these are media companies without editors, so they're completely uncontrolled, which means that the bad actors are controlling it.
Well, media companies usually buy or acquire media, and they work to produce it. Like even a reality TV show that's made up of ordinary people, the media company is paying the cameramen, the sound engineers, the designers, and so on. Facebook doesn't pay anyone, nobody. The media that that goes through its system is 100% produced by third parties, and therefore, just strictly on the definition, it can't be a media company. It isn't a media company.
It's a new media company in the sense that it has figured out, like Twitter, a clever way, a brilliant way of acquiring massive content without paying for it, because we're all stupid enough to put our stuff on it for free. But that doesn't make it any less of a media company. It's just a different. New York Times pays its writers, and Facebook and Twitter don't pay its writers, but they're equally media companies.
Let's start with you and me. There's three things we do with the stuff we produce. Photos, whatever. The first thing we do is we keep them for ourselves. They're private.
Right.
Okay. Facebook actually gives us ways to do that if we want to use it, but I personally use Apple for that.
Okay.
The second thing we do is we share selectively. Facebook gives us ways to do that as well, but I tend to not use that. I use WhatsApp or I use iMessage. Then the third thing, which is the new thing, that, and by new it's 20 years old, but it's relatively new, is the stuff we produce, we make public. We publish it. We are the publisher. We publish it. So Facebook excels at allowing us to be a publisher.
Right.
The question is, if you give someone the ability to be a publisher, are you yourself also a publisher? I don't think so.
Well, you know, these definite. I'm not sure whether You can go round and round on the definitions. The reality is that
actually, it doesn't matter.
The impact of Facebook and Twitter on the world, both from the left and the right, have resulted in people believing that they're media companies, right? You have to acknowledge that the left argues the left argues that Facebook is being manipulated by Russian trolls to support Trump. The right argue that Twitter and Facebook are biased in banning anti-Trump media. So everyone thinks these are media companies. So whether or not they really are is neither here nor there. They're perceived to be. And so we have to treat them as if they are media companies. They claim that they're not because it's in their interest to claim that they're not, because otherwise they're going to get regulated and treated like real media companies.
Well, let's just break it down. I think Battelle is correct, and so are you, in understanding that he makes the point that by these actions, or words to that effect, that yesterday when Facebook blocked the New York Post article, and the New York Post was playing their role of publisher, when Facebook intervened to impact its distribution, they were acting as an editor. I agree with them on that. I personally think that's an error of judgment on their part.
I agree, and I don't disagree with you on that. I think it was a mistake, and Dorsey acknowledged it was a mistake.
Dorsey acknowledged it was a mistake, and they've quickly switched.
No one's defending that. It was a short-sighted decision, presumably by not someone that senior at the company, and it got them in a lot of trouble.
Right, and then the second thing we agree on is the trend is towards both companies, even Twitter, becoming editors. The pressure on them from everyone, Battelle, Kari, yourself, is to take responsibility for what's on their platform. So whether they're platforms or not, the pressure is to become publishers.
And let me just, and the reason for that is not because we're all big brothers or we all want to create some sort of media censorship. The reason for that is because everyone is concerned with the impact of social media on politics and on society, and many people are troubled by it. That's the reason. It's not like everyone wants to just control these companies for the sake of it.
So let's unpick that, because I think that's a very promising territory. I think we'll disagree, but I think we'll have
okay.
We could end up converging. My belief is the only alternative to openness is that somebody's in control. Obviously, logically, somebody is taking decisions. Who is it that has this kind of divine insight that allows them to make good decisions about what is not okay?
Right.
We have to defer to somebody to have those powers. Now, who would that be?
Okay, but let me. So I agree with that, but let me come back here. The critics of social media companies, like myself and Battelle and Kara, and many others, all argue that these companies claim that they're the public space and that they're completely disinterested. But the reality is that they are manipulating the system, the algorithm, for their own interests, which generally tend to be commercial. I don't believe they're either leftists or rightists. They're private companies that are driven to make money, particularly Facebook.
Yeah, well,
and there was an extremely good piece in the Wall Street Journal, which is a right-wing newspaper, about Facebook's undermining of left-wing networks. So the politics doesn't always fall into place here.
Yeah, I
share your idealism on platforms, but the reality is that there is always someone in control, whether it's some government bureaucrat or Mark Zuckerberg or you and I. There is never such a thing as an open network.
Well, yeah, I think you're conflating openness with goals. Facebook has goals, you're right, and its goals are not measured in terms of left and right at all. Its goals are measured in terms of engagement and reach.
Right.
It's an audience. It is an audience network.
Right.
So the one bit of media company that it is an audience network. They even call it that, I believe. If they may have changed it recently. It used to be called the audience network. And so their algorithm is all about getting something read by more people more often.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So that's not an unreasonable goal for a business. That's fine.
Yeah, they're driven by virality. That's their business model.
Now, in order to do that, they try really hard to figure out what you're interested in.
Right. Agreed.
And so they reinforce bubbles.
Right. Agreed.
Intellectual bubbles.
Agreed.
And that means that it's rare to do what you and I are doing now, which is have disagreement between bubbles. It's rare to have a proper discussion. It's less and less likely that there'll be a proper discussion. So all of that's true, and that's baked into the algorithms. But there is definitely no editorial intent there other than reach and engagement. So
I agree with that. But would you accept that the consequences of that, of this echo chamber culture, has been quite corrosive politically, particularly in the United States?
I definitely believe that, and I've been an advocate for a long time to go to the positive side of Facebook and others building tools to encourage engagement between different points of view. Like if I want to go in and
right, but that's not going to happen. I think we actually agree here. I think let me try and figure out a way we agree. I agree with your analysis of social media, but that contradicts your conclusion in your excellent editorial, excellent in every sense except it's wrong. Your excellent editorial that says at the end, Facebook, just stick to being platforms, because as you acknowledge, given their business model of virality, they're not really platforms. They're not platforms in your ideal sense.
Well, let's distinguish between commercial and non-commercial platforms. Or let's say platforms that have growth capability and those that don't. Like the telephone network could never prompt you to make a telephone call, or it would be weird, right?
Yeah.
So one of the new things with the internet and with digital media is the whole concept of growth hacking emerges, because you can actually do things that prompt people to react. And you actually should be fired if you don't do that, because your whole job is to grow your network. That's the job. Now we as human beings choose to use it because it serves various purposes we have, and we allow ourselves to be subjected to those prompts, or sometimes invisible prompts. And it seems to me that goes with the territory. Now imagine that there was a Facebook that wasn't commercial. It was exactly the same.
Yeah.
It had no interest in engagement or reach. It was a pure utility.
Yeah.
Well, firstly, it probably would be boring.
No, it wouldn't, because it would contain it would contain all the opinions of the world. I think it would be the reverse. It'd be less boring than Facebook.
Well, if you go there, then you have to say that discovery would be possible on it, things you didn't previously know about.
Yeah.
Which means that sharing or friends telling you about stuff would happen.
Yeah. It would be less of an echo chamber. And this, I think the solution here, I agree about some of your ambivalence about the government, and I agree that aggressive control of Facebook and Twitter is inappropriate. The real opportunity here, and this comes back to the core issue, the core thing we've always discussed on this show, is innovation. There is a great opportunity for two things: private networks that have figured out ways to solve the Twitter, Facebook problem, but secondly, also public networks, public nonprofit initiatives, like the one that's being pursued by Eli Parisa, who you should get on the show, who was the guy who came up with the very idea of echo chambers in the first place. He was the one who pointed. He's a long-time digital activist who pointed out the problem in the first place. So I think there are two ways of figuring this out: either with a public utility platform connecting all the different networks, or social media alternatives to Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah, I was the founder of a mobile app called Just.me that tried to do exactly that.
Right.
I'm a huge believer in innovation leading to change, and I do believe that Facebook is not forever and Twitter is not forever.
I agree.
And if it was possible to build a genuinely fully distributed network, leveraging people's smartphones and computers to engage, to allow them to engage with whoever they wanted to on whatever topic they wanted, and if that was pure, as in not driven by reach and engagement as the primary goals, I'd be a big fan of it.
I mean, and that's Eli's point about the real challenge and opportunity is to build genuine public space in the digital sphere. The problem with Facebook and Twitter is that they present themselves as representing the public sphere, but these are private companies with the for-profit interests that all private companies have. And that's the contradiction and the problem.
Well, there isn't, because there's another dimension to the discussion, which is probably best put in the context of cancel culture. And, you know, especially the left, and especially the woke left, trying to control platforms to be more like ones they would like.
I agree, but I don't know if is that a critique of Eli Parisa's concept of the public sphere?
No, this is more of a critique of some the attempt to control Facebook and Twitter from the outside, and not just allow them to make up their own decisions as businesses to be what they want to be. There's a strong illiberal layer there that I react against strongly, because I am ultimately believe in freedom to do what you want, and the audience will go where it is happiest.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think that came out with Twitter's decision to censor the New York Post piece, because there are people, particularly in America, people on the left who simply believe that any anti-Biden news is by definition bias and should be banned. And these people are just as problematic and censorious as the Russian trolls. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So that's
we've agreed, Keith. That is really disturbing. What's going wrong?
Well, I think we'll still disagree on detail. I think if we focus,
you've got to get Eli on the show, though, because I think he's really trying to think this stuff about the public space through. But where I think we'll disagree is on this safe harbor issue, which you threw in at the end, and I think it's a different issue. So do you want to just explain the safe harbor stuff and what your position on that is?
Yeah. So, well, the first thing is to understand it. Originally, all internet companies that were platform-like were considered to be in the same space as common carriers are, right? They phone companies. So originally there was no liability for any content that flowed through an internet service. Like,
no, hold on. Let's be clear here. No changing the narrative. The reason why they weren't treated as common carriers because they were treated as phone companies. The reason why the safe harbor thing came into existence in 1997.
No, wait, Andrew. You're going to be fine with what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm in the era before 97 when I'm saying what I'm saying.
Okay, but let's focus on the safe harbor law, because that's the issue you're dealing with.
Yeah, so I want people to understand why that came about. I was the chief technology officer of EasyNet in the UK between 94 and 97. And the police would visit us and ask us to control content in the internet news groups.
Right.
They were specifically using pedophilia as their reason, but actually their interest was way broader than pedophilia. They just knew that everyone was against pedophilia, so it's likely you would be positive towards their request if they started with that. So everybody in the ISP space refused to comply because we didn't want to be responsible for content. Because why didn't we want to be? Because we didn't have the tools to even look at it. Never mind.
But that's neither. But
Now,
Okay, but let's just be clear here.
then
Hold on, wait. Let's just be, because this is a really, really important issue.
Yeah.
So traditional media was always liable. So if you published,
if you
hold on, wait. If you published pedophilia material in a magazine or a newspaper or on a television network, you'd be sued and you'd be probably criminalized.
Yeah.
The argument about,
but wait, go slower.
Right. So we accept that. That's the traditional media law, right?
True, but the key word is publish. You publish.
Okay, but this is coming. Okay, so we're coming back to it.
Yeah.
So Web 2.0 changes everything because suddenly everyone becomes a publisher and anyone can publish anything. And you have these platforms that you idealize that have been sort of gone bad now, but in the beginning seemed very promising, where anyone could publish anything. So the great legal question was back then, should a platform be legally responsible for material that a magazine or a newspaper could be sued for, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, although you put a lot of a history together there.
No, I'm just making a very basic point. That was
in 97. Remember that in 97, none of those things had yet happened. All there was in 97 was like Yahoo. So there was no Web 2.0 yet in 97. Web 2.0.
There was but there was the seeds of Web 2.0. You could still write stuff on websites. You could still comment on books on Amazon.
Well, no one really did. GeoCities.
Right, you had you're beginning to, right?
You're just beginning to, but the Act actually was more focused on internet service providers.
We're talking about an American Act, not British, because you were in Britain.
Yeah, but in the US, the Act was focused on internet service providers.
Right.
Hello, live audience. That was my phone ringing because it's 5 to 3 and I've got a call at 3 o'clock. So let me just say what I was saying.
Can't you put it off? This is real time now TV, Keith. Tell them to wait. Or is it a money call?
I just told him to wait. So what I was going to say was it was focused on people like me at EasyNet and AOL, CompuServe, what was the American one? Something Link, Earthlink.
Right.
And it was asking us to be responsible for content which was mainly then in news groups. Pornography was a big part of it. And that was the origin. And
okay, I agree, but here's the key issue, right? The reason why the law was passed was to protect what was seen as these small startups and promote innovation. And it was believed that the internet was never going to be that big a deal back in 97. No one ever imagined, I mean, Google, Facebook, any of this stuff. So it was just assumed that they were giving these plucky little startups a leg up, right? Is that fair?
That was certainly not the primary purpose, although it was a subtext, yes.
Well, what was the primary purpose?
The primary purpose was to introduce the concept of any accountability at all. It was a carve-out.
Why? Because they were trying to stimulate innovation in this evolving digital economy. And the argument now about changing the law is that the most powerful companies in the world are now benefiting from a law that was designed to support plucky little startups. Whatever you say about Google and Facebook and Twitter, they're not plucky little startups.
I think we'll agree if I say this, Andrew. There were two parts to the motivation. Part A, which represented change, was to introduce the concept of accountability, whereas previously there was no accountability.
Right.
So to me, that's the kind of wedge that opens up the whole thing. And the second part was to carve out from that accountability internet companies for large elements. They still weren't allowed to allow illegal stuff to be published, but everything else was they were not accountable for. And it also later on evolved into things like takedown notices. So there were two elements. The element A is you do have to be accountable. And element B was, but we're going to carve it out.
Right. So anyway, I think we've done a pretty good job here in trying to explain very complicated legislation. My argument is not that the 97 law was wrong or bad, but we've had 23, 24 years since then, and the world has dramatically changed. And just as you had new legislation in 97, it doesn't mean that any law is set in stone, and it can be revised because the world has changed. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Finally, Keith, because you do have to go for your 3 o'clock call. What's your tweet of the week?
Oh, tweet of the week. Well, here we go. We're back to, let me just get it on screen, and then I'll talk about it. Here it is. So the tweet of the week this week is our good friend, Paul Graham.
Your good friend, not mine.
He's become our good friend, I think, Andrew.
Yeah, well, we fantasize about Paul if you're watching.
He asked the question, at what age would you choose to defer starting a startup due to the fact that you need more experience? At what point are you lying to yourself? And his wife said at the age of 26, he said the age of 24, but somewhere in the mid-20s. I said, there are no rules. Everyone is different. I was an idiot until I was 32. I did EasyNet at 40, Real Names at 44, invested in TechCrunch at 51, Archimedes at 56, ADV at 62. No. And that was the week, and Infarm at 66. And by the way, I'm still an idiot.
Yeah, I was going to put the idiot bit back in, but you beat me to that.
Yeah. So tweet of the week is there is no age at which it's appropriate to suddenly decide you are going to do a startup. Andrew, over to you. What have you decided, and how old are you?
I'm definitely older than 26. I think, again, I'm not sure you're interpreting the Graham piece. I think he's suggesting that the ideal age is in the mid-20s. Not that, I don't think he's excluding people like you. I think he's excluding people who are a bit younger. So the question is, should they be giving a lot of money to 18-year-olds? And I think actually the Facebook example proves that they probably shouldn't. Well, it's better to give it to older people like you and I, who are a little bit older than 26.
My retirement fund is very happy they gave money to Facebook.
Yeah, well, you wait. Facebook will crash at some point.
Well, this was definitely a week, Andrew. We started a new format.
I like the new format. I thought your editorial was excellent, and I think next week we should get Eli Parisa on the show to talk about what a public network, or what a network in public space could actually look like, because Eli's been giving it a great deal of thought. Certainly, he can do much more justice to this idea than I can.
I absolutely believe you should do